So we're working with the university crime data from today's date on Learning Suite. So we'll download that file and open it up. No, remove those, that's fine. Enable editing, enable macros, whatever. Okay, so this data really is the same data that you're working with in the database project. So we've got a year that the report was made. We have the state the report is from. We have information about the school that the crime was reported in. We then have, oh, interesting. So we've got a column here. This column doesn't show up in the database project. We've got a column here for the type of information. There's two kinds of numbers that we deal with. One is just informational, that's enrollment, how much enrollment there is at the university. And then we actually have crime numbers. Presumably the enrollment is provided here so you can get some sense of, scale. I can say, what percentage of the students, were involved in crimes and so forth. And so what this first block of data tells me is that for Auburn University in the year of 2006, their enrollment was 5,128 students, and there wasn't a whole lot of crime, but larceny was the only crime that the FBI knew about that happened on the campus of Auburn University. And there were 8 instances of larceny. It seems like there's always someone who knows the difference between larceny, robbery, and burglary. And I can't ever remember it. One is like the person is actually there and you threatened them. One, you entered into their house, and one, you just took their stuff. I'm not sure what the distinction is. They're legal terms. But all three of those, burglary, larceny, and robbery, is you taking something from someone else taking something from you or something. You would never do that, I'm sure. A person taking property. And then there's various other crimes. Okay, so, if I was just looking at this data, and I wanted to know, some question like, which state had the most burglary reported on university campuses? Which state had the most burglary reported in the year 2010? Just looking at this data, that's a pretty tough question to answer. I have to go through and I don't have to look at all these. I could probably do it through filtering. I could come in here and come to data and say put some filters on. Say, well, I'm looking, that's not even going to total it for me though, but if all I'm looking for is one of these, what crime did I say? I forgot the crime. Burglary, so I could come here and say, I only want to see burglary. And yeah, but in terms of getting totals, this gets a little bit difficult. So in terms of saying I want to aggregate data to kind of see, what these sum up as, if I'm looking for, just the sum of a particular set of numbers, we've got a formula that we did, that's great. But what if I want to see all of these sums? It gets a little bit more difficult. Or if I want to say, what's the total amount of arson that's happened at Brigham Young University? So that one I could probably do here. So I could come here and say, school is going to be Brigham Young University. I can find Brigham Young University. Crime, I don't want burglary, I want arson. There's all the cases of arson. So I can now, in this data set, which is 2006 to 2010, it looks like there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The total cases of arson reported is 5 cases of arson. And if I'm just trying to answer one question like that, maybe it's okay. But what if I want to know them all? It gets ugly. Unless I know how to use a pivot table. How many of you are already saying, pivot tables, I got it? Okay, so probably 2/3. Question here? No. So today we're not really learning so much about how to use pivot tables, so I'm glad most of you are already familiar with it. We're going to learn what does it take to automate them, so to build these automatically through code. But let's start first by building out this as a pivot table. So before we start recording anything, let me clear all these filters that I put on here. I guess I can just clear all the filters. And I'm going to come to Insert, to my Insert tab. And then over here on the left, you've probably got something that says Pivot Table. It's probably your very first choice. And so I'm going to choose Pivot Table, and it's going to say, great. I only had one cell selected, and so it says, you really can't build a pivot table with one cell, and so it automatically expanded out to the current region, the set of contiguous data. says, you probably want to build it on this. Yes, that's right. And it says, maybe you want to put this on a new worksheet. Yes, I do. That's fine. And so we'll say, OK. And that builds a pivot table. Now, the very first time I ever came to a pivot table, I'd read about pivot tables and kind of heard it was kind of something fancy and new in the late 90s. And I thought, maybe I should learn how to do this. I got this far and was utterly befuddled. I gave up. I got here and I'm like, well, now what do? I don't know. So let me give myself a little more room here. So this pivot table over here, this is just telling you that something's going to happen over here. But over here in your list, these are the list of columns that you had in the table that you had selected. What we're now going to say is we're going to say, I want to summarize all of this data according to something. Let's just say I want to summarize it in total. So I could say I just want to bring these values. I'll bring my value. That's the numeric. That's the one that tells me, how much arson was it, how much burglary, whatever. I'm going to drag that down here to a value, and it has now summarized that whole data down to one single cell. It is giving me the sum of value. Is this meaningful at all? Why is this number really kind of unmeaningful? Yep. Yeah, I've got enrollment mixed in with my crime data. So if I could separate those out and say, I don't want to filter it all, I just want to see crime data, then that would be meaningful, at least with the total number of crimes that were reported in this set. Well, that's what we would use a filter for. So let me take my type, and I'm going to make this a report filter. So now, with that as a filter, up here I'm going to have the ability to choose, well, which of these do I want? Well, I want to see the crime numbers. And now all of my summarization will now only be for the records that meet the criteria of crime, right? If I come back here to my crime data, then I'm now ignoring all the rows that say information because I've told it to summarize only the crime. So far, so good? So that filter can be kind of handy. So that means in this data set, we've got, 416,000 reported crimes that happened on university campuses. Kind of sounds like a university campus, not such a safe place to be. That's a big number. So, but the real power of a pivot table is not that it can do it down to one cell, it's that I can look at that according to multiple dimensions. So let's just go ahead and say, let's start off by saying, I want to view that by year. And so I'll take the report year, and I'm going to bring this in as a column header. So I'll drop that as a column, and now it's going to say, okay, now we're going to give you multiple totals, and it'll be by year. So now I'm seeing how much crime was reported on each one of these campuses. What's the total crime reported on campuses in each one of these years? And in fact, I can get more specific on that. Let's go to a different dimension first. So now let's do this. Instead of saying just by year, I want to see the difference by year and by state. So I'll bring state down, and I will drop that as a row header. And now this will give me a table. I'm looking at 2 dimensions simultaneously here, where I can look here and it says, okay, in the year 2006, on all the campuses of universities and colleges in Alaska, that's how many different crimes we have reported. So far, so good? That's really the power of a pivot table. It allows you to have multiple dimensions and summarize that data. I got this table now. I can look, and it gives me totals. Here's still the total for all of Alabama across those years. I want to see the total for the year across all the different states. I want to see the grand total. Those numbers are all right here. It's very nice. I don't know if it's still this way, but this used to be one of the things that recruiters would use to tell just how good are you with Excel. And so they'd ask some question about, what would you do with a pivot table? And if you could answer that, they would go, okay, you really are serious about Excel. And if you couldn't, they go, okay, you're just starting. But that was kind of one of the things they used to gauge with. Now, I'm not limited to just one column header or one row header. So I could bring in the crime, the label, and I could bring that in as a secondary column header. So now that I have that label on here, so now I've got, for 2006, I've got all of the different numbers, still we're restricted just to crime here. I've got all of the different numbers listed here. So now I can see 2006 in Alabama, how much assault was there, how much arson was there in Alabama. Looks like there was none reported. Like we don't know for sure. In Alaska, we had reports from everywhere, but there was none. So assault, theft, burglary. And again, I get the total for 2006. I can collapse this. Oh, let's see. Collapse this. Yeah, so I can collapse these numbers down so that they're only showing 2007, but I can drill into them to see what's behind those numbers. If I want to collapse that whole column, I can right-click, and there's something like expand, collapse, entire field. Oops, did I expand it? Expand, collapse entire field. Yeah, so that collapses all of those down. And I could do the same thing. I could bring school in as another level for my rows. Now I've got all the schools in Alabama, and these numbers are all split out. So it's very nice. And I can even bring campus below schools, so when there are multiple campuses, they get broken out as well. Maybe I'll collapse this one. Expand, collapse, collapse entire. So now when we've got a school with multiple campuses, it'd be nice if it only showed the plus when there was a campus, a multiple campus. I forget who has multiple campuses here. Maybe Texas does. URS. Texas A&M probably has multiple campuses. Yeah, so Texas A&M has multiple campuses. I can expand that out, see the detail for all their different campuses. It's really pretty neat. It turns out that when we start recording ourselves doing this, it's going to do a pretty good job of getting us the code to work with, but we're going to have to do quite a bit of work to be able to make it really be meaningful code that just doesn't record what I did so I can see what I did, but actually make it useful in multiple cases. Okay, so questions on the pivot table itself before we start to work with the code? In the back?
This kind of stuff might be useful, for example, if you're going to do representation. Would that be kind of stuff that you want to be able to use to say, like, here's like average time of day versus, I don't know, type of whatever you're selling, just as an example?
Oh, sure, yeah. So the question is this the kind of thing you would do for a report automation? And the answer is yes, it's exactly what we would do. So here's the idea, is that we might end up with, importing some data from some database. In this case, we've got crime data. It could be sales data, whatever. We could have time of day and for the sale, different sales, different products and whatever. And it may very well be that we've got to look at this whole set of data, and we've got to produce several different reports, right? One's got to go to the manager who's in charge of a particular product line, right? We've got all the product lines, and we want to give reports that are just to the particular product line to different managers and such. And so we could bring in the data, say, build the pivot table. That's going to get onto a particular sheet, export that sheet, and then rebuild the pivot table to have different, configured for a different setting, export that one, and then we could end up with a series. In fact, we could even make it so that it would automatically email them off to these people as well, right? We know how to automatically send emails, we know how to attach files, and so we can make a process that just says, yeah, we've got the data here, run the pre-built reports, email them to the people that have to have them, and then take the rest of the day off, because you just did what the last intern used to take all week doing. And it took you 10 minutes. So that's the idea here. Take this process and automate it. Other questions? Okay, I'm going to throw away, go ahead, another question. A little louder. You have access to these recordings usually within an hour after the class ends. Oh yeah, am I going to take these away from you? Yeah, you should retain access to the Learning Suite site even though the class is over, and those will all be there for you. Yeah, so am I going to feel obligated to keep them open for you for like 5 years from now? No, not really, but I don't really have a plan to take them down either, so. Oh, plus they're on YouTube. I don't think I'm going to take them off of YouTube, so if you've got the links, I'm actually publishing them to YouTube. Good point. The university might make me take them off of YouTube, but I don't have any plan to take them off. University's getting kind of antsy about stuff that they publish from class. You can imagine, right? Let me pause. All right. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead so sheet 1 is where my pivot table is. We've gone through it once. Now we're going to record ourselves going through it again. Then we'll look at the code and start to modify it. So I'm going to delete this pivot table. Yes, I'm really sure. All right, and then let's record ourselves again. So developer tab, record macro. Macro 1, why don't I call it make pivot table. And we'll say OK. So I start off by saying insert table. Oops, not table. Pivot table. I got to the right place. I did it too fast. Insert pivot table. Oh, here it is. So insert pivot table. It automatically extends out to the data that I want. That's where I want to do it. That's great. New worksheet. Beautiful. And I'm going to make this one a little bit simpler. I'm only going to have one level on any dimension. So I'm going to start by bringing in my value as a value. I'll put my type as a filter. I'm going to drag. Why don't we bring report year? No, let's bring. Let's leave the year. Yeah, I guess we'll bring the label as the column. I think we'll leave all of the report years aggregated together. And then I will bring the school as my row. So now I'm just looking at a simpler pivot table. I've got all the schools listed here, and then I can see their various total amounts of crime in the data set. That's it. And I'll stop recording. All right, let's go take a look at the code. So modules, module 1. And it's really pretty ugly. But it's not that much of ugly, so we should be okay. I'm going to get rid of these comments just so we have a little more room to see what's going on here. Okay, so here's the first thing we have to realize is that there are two, similarly to when we make a chart, there are two objects that are fundamental to how we work with charts. Oh, for full credit for class participation, can you tell me one of those objects? So what's the name of one of the objects that we've got to work with charts? I'm hearing it over here. Yep. Shape is one of them. So anytime we make a chart, there's actually an object called shape. That's what goes onto the page. The chart goes into the shape. So the shape object is one. Still for full credit, we're getting kind of down to the last couple of days for full credit. So what's the name of the other object we work with when we're working with charts? The other kind of object. It is called the chart object. So we've got shapes and charts that we're dealing with. Pivot tables, similar thing. There are two different objects that we have to get familiar with. Can you guess what one of them is? That'd be full credit if you can guess this. After all, we're working with pivot tables. The object is pivot table. Does no one, who needs full credit still? Anyone? There's a couple of you out there. So pivot table is one of them. The other one is called a pivot cache. And the recorder records a whole potload of things happening right here in this one long statement. We're going to parse it out to deal with the pivot cache as one and the pivot table as a separate one. All right, so as we're going to get going, we're going to declare three object variables to work with. First of all, we're working with a sheet. We're adding a new sheet, so I'm going to create an object variable that will allow me to refer to that sheet. I'll just call it S as a worksheet. I'm going to need a pivot table and a pivot cache. So I will dim PT as a pivot table, and I will dim PC as a pivot cache. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do here, so here's the first line of code that the macro recorder created. Sheets.add. For full credit for class participation, what does sheets.add do? It adds a sheet. Very good. Now, also for full credit for class participation, if I want to be able to capture a reference to the sheet that gets added, what do I do? I've got a variable here that can refer to a sheet. What do I have to do to get that variable actually referring to the newly created sheet? What's the Visual Basic for Applications keyword that it takes to do that? Yep. Set. That's correct. How are we doing on there? Anyone else need full credit? So set S equal to sheets.add. So sheets.add is going to add a new sheet, but now I'm going to have a reference to that sheet whoops, not A. They're right next to each other on the keyboard in my defense. S. So now I can just refer to S and it will be that newly created worksheet. So if I want to change the name, I want to make it active, whatever, I can just use that object reference. Okay, that's the easy part. Let's look at this next statement. It takes 3 lines to record it, and there's crazy things happening here. Active workbook dot pivot caches. So there's an object that's a collection. It's the collection of all the pivot caches for this workbook. Actually, for the active workbook. I think I would prefer to change this from active workbook to this workbook. For class participation credit, what's the difference between this workbook and active workbook? Anyone still need credit? See any hands? The active workbook is whichever workbook happens to be active at the moment when this code runs. This workbook says, I don't care which workbook's active. I'm talking about the workbook that has this module in it. This module is in a workbook. And when I say this workbook dot, I'm saying whatever workbook this module is attached to. The module that contains this code. All right, so now it's going to be this workbook's pivot caches and then create. We're making a new one. The create method for a pivot cache has all of these arguments. It's got to know the source type. It's going to be an Excel database. Seems like a weird type, but it means the data is going to be living here in Excel. Can I make a pivot table where the data is not in Excel? Yeah, I can just say go connect up to this database somewhere and use that as the data for this pivot table. Don't even import it into Excel, just build the pivot table off of that remote data source. That's possible. Was there a question here? Nope. The data source then is going to take a little bit of work here because you can see what's the problem with this particular data source, this statement for data source. It goes right down to row number 23,164. What happens if the next time I run this, I've got more data? It's going to ignore anything past that. When I create the table, when I create the pivot table, it automatically extends out to the relevant data, but then it records the absolute reference to that data. So we'll have to make some modifications here. And then this is like I guess the version of something. I don't even know what version that is. Anyone have a different version than 6 here? Yeah, you do? What's your version number? Excel pivot table version 15. You got Excel 2013? Yeah, so that's probably a change between 2016, how it records in 2016 and how it records in the other one. Tell me that again. Not yet, I'm not quite ready for it. Excel pivot table. That's a 5. They got tired of recording this big long constant apparently, and they just put the number in instead. So if you're on 2013, you've got a 5 there. It may look like a long name, but it's a 5. And then here we've got a 6. So apparently that's telling us something about the version. And there may be some issues with that with backwards compatibility. Can a 2013 table open a version 6? Can we run this code with version 6? I don't know the answer to that. We'll just stick with the version that you created on your system. If we have some time, I might try to roll this back to a 5 and see how it behaves. Okay, that is the end of the parameters for the create statement. So what is going on here? We say create, and then we say dot create pivot table. Can someone tell me what's going on here? It seems so strange. Here's a method. I'm giving it all these arguments, and then I've got a dot after it. What's going on? Yeah?
I'm guessing the create creates a pivot cache object, and that has a method called create.
That is exactly right. So this create method is going to create a pivot cache object. The pivot cache object will be returned by the create method. And so everything up to this point here is going to evaluate to the newly created pivot cache. A pivot cache has a create pivot table method. And so it's calling that. I don't want to do this all in one step. I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to bring this part down, and we're going to work just on this statement. We'll get this statement clean, and then we'll work on the pivot table separately. Okay, so now this is going to return a reference to a pivot cache. What am I going to do right in front of this then? What keyword will I use right here? Set. I'm going to set PC, my pivot cache variable, equal to the statement that creates that pivot cache. So the pivot cache is something that says, give me this data in such a way that I'm ready to work with it. Get it cached here so that that pivot table can display the information quickly as the user changes the value and what's shown in that pivot table. I want to hit that cache to be able to display that data. I don't have to go back to the database to get it. I don't want to have to go back and read the data off the worksheet again. I've already got that data organized in my pivot cache. Okay. So everything looks good here except this. So crime data is the name of my sheet, and I've got to get this adjusted so it's going to pull in that particular set of data. So let's do this. Instead of, I think data source can either take a string or it can take a range object. And so I'm just going to give this a range that will have the right data that I'm after. So I'm going to get rid of the string argument here. And I'm going to say the name of my sheet, which is, oh look, crime data is a sheet that's declared here, and it already has a name, data. So I should be able to say data dot range A1. So that's going to get me to the cell in the upper left-hand corner. And now if I want to refer to the whole entire set of contiguous data, what do I put next? Dot current region. And so my data source is just going to be that whole current region from cell A1. I like it. This next line here is defective, so I'm going to comment both of those, put comments there. I'm going to put a breakpoint here, and I'm going to run my code up to that point. I just want to make sure that I can create the pivot cache okay. That pivot cache line executed without error, so I'm feeling pretty good about my pivot cache. Questions? Yes?
I don't have a source data equals on my.
What do you have? No source data equals? Let me take a look. Hey, Cameron, are you working on getting those other user form assignments created? Let me take a look and see what this is. Well, that's the problem. It's all upside down. Oh, that's better. So what version of Excel?
2013.
2013. Workbooks. Pivot cache. Create pivot table. Table name. Pivot table 3. Table destination. Okay, it looks like you already had an existing pivot cache. And so it's building this on the same cache. What you'll want to do is record yourself. First of all, did you delete the sheet the first one we did? If you
Maybe I did.
Okay, so folks, what I did was I did that first pivot table example by hand, and then I deleted that whole sheet, which deleted the pivot cache that was first defined on it. If I already had a pivot cache built on that, and I said I'm going to make another pivot table on that same set of data, Excel is going to realize, oh, you've already got a pivot cache on this data, and it's not going to create another pivot cache for it. And so your code will look different if you didn't delete that sheet. Was that the case?
I
think so. Okay. So this is assuming we've deleted. We don't have any pivot tables in the workbook we're working with. Okay, other questions? All right, so now let's take a look at what we have to do for this pivot table. So just as the create statement for the pivot caches returns a reference to the cache that it creates, the create pivot table method returns a reference to the pivot table that it creates. Here's one of the times when it's really important to understand when we have to use parentheses around methods that we're calling, around the arguments for methods. So here, there were already parentheses around the argument list because we were going to do something after it. We changed it to not do something after it, but instead to accept the return value and assign it to a variable. Anytime I'm doing something with the return value of a method or a function, I've got to put parentheses around the argument list. So here we're going to see when I look at this create pivot table, First of all, it's a method of the pivot cache object, so I'll just say PC dot create pivot table, and again, I'm going to want to do something with the return value, so I've got to put parentheses around the argument list. They weren't there before because when it recorded, it wasn't doing anything with it, it was just creating it. But now I want to capture the reference to that pivot table, so set PT equal to the create pivot table method of the pivot cache object. Set PT equal to, that looks perfect. Oh, I've still got this single quote in here. There we go. So now, at this point, when I run this statement, it will give me a pivot table. But again, I want to make sure, I want to look through this and make sure that I've got everything set up the way I want it to be. Table destination. What's the problem here? The sheet name is hard-coded. Again, I think my table destination can be a range as well. I mean, I could build up a string that's right, but I just want it to be, let's see, row 3, column 1. That's A3 on sheet 2? No, whatever sheet got created. Fortunately, I've captured a reference to that sheet. So here I'm just going to say I want this to be sheet S dot range. And the range I want it to be is A3. And so that should put that destination on the newly created sheet to A3. When the recorder did it, it said, great, we made a sheet, and then it recorded, oh, we're putting something on sheet 2, and so it just recorded sheet 2. But we've got to make the code a little more dynamic. Pivot table name, pivot table 2, I think will be okay, even if we have this on, if we have multiple pivot tables created, as long as they're on different sheets, I don't think those names will step on each other's toes. If they do, we can come back and modify this one. All right, I'm going to execute that statement, and I should have a pivot table. Looks like it won't let me do it, so I'm just going to stop it and run it from scratch again, and those both execute without any trouble. All right, next statement, select sheets 2. What do I need to change this to? Actually, we need to change it to nothing. What's the active sheet? Active sheet's the most recently created sheet. It's already active. I'm not even sure it has to be active, but I certainly don't have to activate it again. So I'm just going to get rid of this line. And it selects cell A3 here. Again, I don't think it needs to be active. I'm just going to get rid of this line as well. It's kind of an artifact of the recorder. Okay. What is this line telling me? This is where I put in the value field. So we can see we're adding a data field. And which field am I adding? I'm adding the field named value. I'm giving it a name, sum of value, and it's going to be a sum. It can be an average, it could be the minimum, it can be the maximum. There's lots of different choices I can have here. Sum is the default. That's what this is saying. All right, so let's look at this right here. Someone look at that line and tell me, what is that evaluating to? What kind of object do you think the part I have highlighted in blue is evaluating to? So say it again. This is the pivot table. So this is looking at the sheet, looking at the collection of all the pivot tables on this sheet and the one with this name. Is that, so how could I shorten that? PT, right. I collected the reference to the newly created pivot table right up here. And so anywhere I've got this long thing that says on the active sheet, pivot table, whatever, I can just say PT. That's great. And you'll notice we're calling the add data field, and it has to get a reference to the data field that it's going to add. And it has this whole part here, again, on that pivot table. Right? Active sheet, pivot tables, pivot table 2. That's my pivot table, PT. That looks better. So I'm going to call the add data field method of the pivot table, and I'm passing it a particular field from the pivot table. I'm giving it a label here, sum of value. So here I'm building this about crime. So you know what I could put? I could change it to total crime. And it's going to be a sum. Hey, that's better. So let's now, so questions here? So we've added the data field. We should now add the column and then add the row. And did we put a filter on? Yeah, we did. We did the type first. Pivot field's type. Okay, so the next one is the filter that's going to go at the top of the page. So let me just isolate this next argument and we'll look at this. Okay, so this one is a with block because it's going to change two properties. It's going to set two properties of this. One, it's going to tell us what kind of field this is going to be. We're setting it to be a page field, the filter at the top. And we're telling it, by the way, this is the first one in my set of page fields, How many page fields are there right now before I execute this line? There's none. Do I really need to tell it to make it the first one? No, it's going to be the first one. That's where it's going to go. And so I don't really need to set this property at all. So I'll get rid of that. And now that I'm only dealing with one property, having the with statement is pointless. So I'll get rid of the with statement and the end with. I'm just simplifying this down. And I'll bring this up onto the same line. So this is really the statement that we're working with. I don't have to tell it to be the first position. It's going to be the only one there. It'll be the first position. Even if I'm going to add multiple ones, if I add them in order, they're going to go in order. It'll record this is now the second one. I don't have to do that. It's going to go in order. Okay, active sheet, pivot table's pivot table. That's reference to my pivot table. I'll just change that to PT. Pivot fields type, orientation, Excel page field. That looks a lot better, doesn't it? Yeah, so this is the one that's setting up the filter. The page filter. And then we'll have something really similar for these other ones. I'll just go through that same process. So here we're putting in the column header. So PT, the label field, orientation is going to be a column field. And we'll do the same thing with our row field. PT. What was the question?
So now that there's going to be multiple, one's in column, one's in row.
That's right. We've got a page filter, a column header, and a row header. Just one. Even if I have to have two, I don't need to tell it the position because it's just going to go into the next position. That position will allow me to, if I've already got some filters in there, I could say I don't want this to go to the end of the list. I want it to go somewhere in the middle of the list. But if I'm building the table, I can control that just by the order in which I add them. And it looks like I record myself scrolling a couple of times, not necessary. And I may just go ahead and put these all as one block without space between them. So I'm adjusting all of my fields. So we've taken what was a pretty ugly looking block of code and really made it pretty reasonable. Make pivot table, we declare a few variables. We create our pivot cache, create the pivot table, configure the pivot table. So we run it and see if it works. I'm all for that. I'm going to run this. No errors. It's created a new sheet for me. Actually, looks like I've run it a few times already. I'm going to delete all of these except, in fact, I'm going to delete them all. And I'll run it again. Delete. All right, so I've only got my crime data sheet. Come to my developer list of macros, make pivot table. I'll run that. And it creates this sheet 6, gives me the pivot table. It's configured just the way that I set it up to be configured. Question?
The only thing that I noticed is that the filter, the type, you're still including the information.
Oh yeah, did I?
It didn't say just crime.
When I recorded it, I don't think I changed it to crime, did I? So why don't we go ahead and I don't know how to write that. So let's just record it and see what it records. So cancel that. I'm going to turn the recorder on. Macro 2, that's a great name. And I will change this just to crime. I will stop that. Hope it recorded something. Sometimes, this happened more in 2007 than it has in later versions, but you'll record, so you just go through some long process doing something like this. Look at what it recorded. Here would be your macro with nothing recorded in it. But here it looks like we've got something. So it looks like it's clearing the filters. There's a clear all filters. And then it's setting the current page to a particular value. Yeah, I like it. I'll bring that right. And you're right. I think I do want to have that as part of the way my initial pivot table is created. And I will go ahead and do that right immediately when I set that page filter. So PT for my pivot table. Pivot fields type. I'll clear all filters. I don't really need to clear all the filters because I'm just creating it right now. No reason to clear it. And then PT current page is crime. So now, if I run this one, it should give me another pivot table on a new sheet, and crime is already set as the value here. Okay, in-class exercise, take this code and modify it such that we add in the state above, as a row field above the school, and add in year so that it goes above the label. If you want to, record yourself doing it and get a look at it, or just see if you can infer how to do that from looking at the code. So we'll take a couple of minutes and let you work through that. Yeah, so you remember the very first one that we did, it had two levels. It had a year level up here as a column, and then it had the type. It had the label. And then over here we had the state, and then we had the college name under the state. So what we're after is building this. I'll just do it. I mean, it's pretty easy to do here. Value. I want the report year to be above here, and I want the state to be above on the row. So I want to have it so that when this gets built, it already has these two levels. It's got state and then school. It's got year and then crime. So if you're not quite getting this code to work, let's go ahead and call me over and I'll take a look. And okay, so I'm going to have another column. So I'm going to copy my column, and I think I just have report year. Is it just called report year? R-E-P-O-R-T year. There's a space in it. What was I thinking when I put a space in it? And then for school, we just had state. S-T-A-T-E. And so, is that what you had, something like that? Be able to run that and see that it brought those up. And that's given those to me. That looks great. I wonder what it'd take for me to be able to collapse this. I don't know. Let me record it and find out. So rather than have these already pre-expanded, I will just right-click and choose Expand Collapse, collapse entire field. And I'll do that for both the year and for the state. Expand, collapse, collapse entire field. Stop recording. So it looks like it's just show detail false. That's pretty easy. So maybe I'll do that after I've built everything out. I'll just collapse them here. So active sheet, pivot table 2. That's my pivot table. Pivot field state, show detail is false. And then presumably have the same thing for report year. I'll run that. Now it creates it pre-collapsed so I can drill into it to see the information that I want. Okay, any other questions on pivot tables? I've now told you everything I know about automating pivot tables, and I've said some of it twice. So what's the next step? Whatever else you have to do with the pivot table, just record yourself doing it, and you've got the framework to be able to build this out the way that you want to do it. Question?
Just from using pivot tables in the past, that stays that when you refresh, you're creating a pivot table off of the database that you're adjusting the data inside the actual database. Every single time you do that, you have to go or something that are happening on that. You have to do that whenever it's so it'll automatically refresh the data.
So yeah, so the question is, so if we're building the data off of a database, so the data are changing. But we could probably see that right here. Let's see what happens. And in fact, that's what's happening here because we're building that pivot cache each time. And so in this case, we are rereading the data. And so your comment is, it would be great.
Yeah, I guess that'd just be a different program, but
So when you're working with pivot table that's built on a database, there's a separate process that you have to go through to say, I want to refresh this cache so that my data gets the most recent information from the database. There's a way to refresh the cache. Yeah, and I'm not quite sure what that is. Let's just take a look real quick and see if there's a method for it. It'd be the pivot cache. It's probably a method of the pivot cache. pc.refresh. So there's a method of the pivot cache just to say I want to refresh the particular pivot cache. And so, if I've got that situation where the data is changing in the database in the background, I need to be able to refresh it. I can just execute the statement that says refresh this cache, and the pivot table is ready to be rebuilt again off of that. Question? Oh, okay, so here we're getting down to this particular pivot field right here. So at some point we're saying pivot field state. So anywhere I've got the object pivot field, we're putting the orientation in, and then the show detail equals false. We could probably do this inside a with block. My rule of thumb is I got to have at least 3 lines of the same object before I'm thinking I want to make a with block out of this. It turns out the with block executes a little bit faster because it doesn't have to resolve this object each time. But you're talking about not even milliseconds. You're talking about nanoseconds in difference in time. But yeah, we could make this. So yeah, adding 2 lines to save, that I'm not so fond of it. But I am curious to see if it behaves. So the show detail is set to false here, and then we add another one if it still stays collapsed. I don't know the answer to that, so let me go ahead and run that. Looks like I can't do that unless I've added the orientation first. So if I were doing this with a with block, this statement would have to come into the with block before this one. So there's some path dependency. It looks like I can't say show detail unless there's 2 fields there to hide the detail from.
What's the dot current page method again?
So the question is, what's the dot current page method? And what the current page is saying I've put the type field as a report filter. So by making this an XL page type of field, that's what comes up right here. So here's type, and we've got 2 types in our data. Let's go back to the data. So our 2 types of data are either information or crime data. So this is called type. So that field in my pivot table allows me to put the type here with those 2 choices to restrict the data. And so by making my type column of the orientation page field, that's what puts it up here. And then the current page says which of all the values that are in that page filter should be selected. So here we're putting filtering that value down. Question?
Is there a way to now do math on values?
So the question is, can we now do math on values? Certainly. What do you have in mind?
I don't know. Add up the arson and the robbery and the other one. I know that's simple. We can do it other ways.
Yeah, but the question is, can we put a calculated field right in here somewhere? And if we've got someone who's really good with pivot tables, maybe they could tell us how to do that. Maybe we can do it. It'd take me a little research to figure out how to do that. But if we knew how to do it, we could record it, and then I could code it. Is the question over here or answer? Oh, right. So yeah, there are some things that we can do here, pretty straightforward. So one of the settings that we can have in here, if I come down here to my values, right now, it's just showing the average of the raw numbers, or it's showing the total of the raw numbers. But I can come in here to value field settings, and I've got lots of different settings I can choose from. So over here I can say show values as, and I can do a calculation here. So I can do the percent of the row total, percent of the column total, percent of the grand total. So there are some pre-canned things that I can do here. Like, let's see. For this, let's make this a percentage of the row total. And then out of this whole row, 18% is, in this number. So you have those kinds of calculations. That's what you were talking about over here, or? Oh, per capita. Yeah. So actually bring in that enrollment number. Do you know how to make that calculation? Subtotals, label, cancel. Let me go and back this one off. I will show this as no calculation. So yeah, it would be nice to see if this was a per capita, right? Based on the enrollment. I'm not sure how to make that calculation. Other questions? So you're saying we have one here called percentage of. Oh, interesting. So show values as, my base field should be my value, and base item should be label, and enrollment. Well, I mean, it's not going to break it. Let's see what it does. Yeah, so we're just demonstrating that I really don't know how to do this. And show values as, no calculation. But it looks like there's something built in that we could probably get there with little work. And of course, you could do that with your data before you brought it into the pivot table by just creating another column instead of having, oh, that would still be a little difficult too because you've got these numbers that have to be divided this way. So that's a little bit of a pain. There's probably a way to do it. I don't know how to do it.